Latina 135 and its relationship with the bilingual tradition of First Corinthians. Anna, the floor is yours, and the computer will follow up.
Am I sharing the screen or not at the moment? Okay. Forwards, backwards, and that is exactly people. You can't do it yet.
I think so.
Well,
No?
there you go, that should be.
Yes. Dear colleagues, after learning a lot about the Latin tradition of Galatians, now we turn to the Latin tradition of another Pauline epistle, namely 1 Corinthians. More specifically, this presentation deals with a manuscript, Vetus Latina 135, which I transcribed, collated, and studied in preparation of the Vetus Latina edition of 1 Corinthians, which will be one of the outcomes of the One Core project, text transmission and translation of 1 Corinthians in the first millennium, an FWO Odysseus Type 1 project led by Professor Christina Kreinecke at KU Leuven. I'm also grateful to Oliver Norris for letting me know about the presence of the elements in Galatians in this manuscript, and this really stimulating the study of the text in 1 Corinthians. So first, I will describe the manuscript, and then I will carry out a quantitative and qualitative examination of the text to show the unexpected close relationship between 135 and the Vetus Latina text type D, which is reconstructed on the basis of the bilingual manuscripts transmitting 1 Corinthians. First, I will define the number of non-Vulgate readings of 135 shared with the Vetus Latina manuscripts belonging to text type D. Then I will analyze these non-Vulgate readings, which include common errors, variants attested in the Greek texts transmitted by bilingual manuscripts, and similarities in the translation technique. Biblioteca Ambrosiana E26 Inferior is also known in the Vetus Latina editions as Gamma B. This is a Bible in 2 volumes, of which only the second one is preserved. It contains the biblical text from Chronicles to Hebrews 8:11. The Pauline Epistles are the only part of the New Testament copied in this manuscript, and they are organized according to the Vulgate order. 1 Corinthians is contained from folio 278 verso to 284 recto, and is preceded by the Argumentum 15MA and by the Capitula of type A according to the Bruner's classification. 135 is dated to the second quarter of the 9th century and was copied in northern Italy, possibly in Bobbio, hence the denomination the Bobbio Bible. It has 307 folios with 2 columns per page and measures 450 per 300 millimeters. It is written in Caroline script, and 2 hands have been identified and the text has been corrected. In the introduction to the Vetus Latina edition of 1 Corinthians, Uwe Fröhlich assigned 135 to text type I, namely to the pre-Vulgate Italian textual form circulating in the early 5th century. Fröhlich observed similarities with the tradition of Ambrosiaster and identified 30 readings in common with Ambrosiaster in the 59 verses of the epistle that he selected. These are taken from chapters 1 to chapter 8. However, his examination of the manuscript according to text passages needs to be revised. In this paper, I will show that the analysis of the complete text of the letter leads us to a different conclusion, namely that the manuscript should be assigned to text type D and not to text type I. First, it is important to define what text types D and I are in order to identify the text type to which 135 can be assigned. The text types are indicated in the section of the Vetus Latina edition called the schema. Here the text types are arranged in chronological order from the African text types X and K coming first, followed by the European text type D, I, and V. Text type D is the earliest European version of the Pauline Epistles, going back to an archetype dated to the middle of the 4th century. Its reconstruction is only based on manuscripts, namely Vetus Latina 75, 76, 77, partly 78, and 89. Text type I is a slightly later European version and is reconstructed on one main source, Ambrosiaster's commentary on the Pauline Epistles, and with several secondary sources, such as Vetus Latina 61, manuscript B of Pelagius' commentary, Jerome's, Rufinus, and Augustine's citations, among others. Let's look at text type D. Text type D is based on two main sources, Vetus Latina 75, Codex Claromontanus, which was copied in southern Italy in the mid-5th century, and is a bilingual manuscript with the Greek and Latin texts on facing pages. Its copy, Vetus Latina 76, also called Codex Sangermanensis, is used to reconstruct text type D when there are lacunae in 75 and at 1 Corinthians 14, 8, 18, where 75 has a lacuna, and it is also used to reconstruct the text when there are scribal mistakes in 75. This is also a bilingual manuscript which was copied in the 9th century, possibly in France, and has the Greek and Latin texts on facing columns. The other main source of text type D is Vetus Latina 89, the anonymous commentary on Paul, copied in Saint-Amand around 800, which attests a text mixed with text type I. Moreover, there are two bilingual manuscripts that are occasionally used to build text type D, when the other sources of the text type disagree. These are Vetus Latina 77, Codex Bernerianus, copied in St. Gall between 860 and 870, an interlinear bilingual manuscript. I'm confident that we learn more about the Latin text in Codex Bernerianus from Alec Fisher's presentation later today. Vetus Latina 78, or Codex Argensis, was copied in Reichenau in the last third of the 9th century, but this is of relative importance for the reconstruction of text type D because its Latin text is mostly Vulgate, with doublets in Romans and 1 Corinthians derived from the exemplar of 77. The bilingual manuscripts of this group go back to a common archetype called Z, dated to the middle of the 4th century, consisting of a Greek text with Western readings and a separate Latin text which have been partially harmonized. The new transcription and collation of 135 shows several readings in common with these manuscripts. The common scholarly opinion, I cite here Frede, the authority on the matter, is that the Latin text transmitted by bilingual manuscripts did not influence the rest of the Latin tradition. The discovery of 89, a monolingual manuscript with readings of text type D, has proven that this is not entirely true. The examination of 135 will further refute the idea that text type D remained confined to bilingual manuscripts. The text of 1 Corinthians in 135 was excluded from the collation of the Vetus Latina manuscripts of the principal Pauline Epistles carried out by Houghton, Kranecker, McLellan, and Smith, because 1 Corinthians in this manuscript was considered to be largely Vulgate. Because of time constraints, Hugh Houghton transcribed only chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians and was indeed right in concluding that the text is affiliated with the Vulgate. The table attached shows that only 17 non-Vulgate variants are attested in chapter 1, which has a considerable length and is conventionally divided into 31 verses. The table shows that the non-Vulgate variants are not numerous in the first 4 chapters in relation to their length. This observation may lead us to conclude with Houghton that the manuscript is affiliated with the Vulgate. However, the full transcription of the manuscript has enabled me to identify an increasing number of non-Vulgate readings from chapter 5 onwards. For instance, chapter 12, which has 31 verses, as many as chapter 1, attests 57 variants, while chapter 1 has only 17 variants. Possibly there was a change in the manuscript used for 1 Corinthians in 135, the beginning of the letter as a Vulgate text, while the following chapters contain a high number of readings differing from the Vulgate. In total, 716 non-Vulgate readings have been identified. a number high enough to label this manuscript as a Vetus Latina manuscript. By comparing 135 with the other surviving Vetus Latina manuscripts, it is possible to identify the source closest to 135. Since Fröhlich situated the manuscript in text type I also made a collection with the lemma text of Ambrosiaster's commentary on the Pauline Epistles, which is the main source of text type I. The collation shows that the manuscript that have the highest number of non-Vulgate readings in common with 135 are those belonging to text type D, namely 75, 76, and 89, which have more than 250 shared variants. Other three manuscripts have more than 100 variants in common, and these are the bilinguals 77 and 78, which are also sources of text type D, and Vetus Latina 61, the manuscript that together with Ambrosiaster is used to reconstruct text type I. The relationship with Ambrosiaster's lemma text is also close, as Fröhlich noticed. There are 235 readings in common. The high number of variants, 197 excluding scribal mistakes, which are unattested in other sources, is also noteworthy. Nonetheless, the manuscripts, which are the main sources of text type D, 75, 76, and 89, are the closest to 135. Manuscripts which score low in the table are those that are fragmentary or preserve isolated lections of 1 Corinthians, hence the low agreement with 135. A closer examination of the relationship with these manuscripts which form text type D appears to be necessary. I identified 109 variants out of 716 variants that 135 has in common with the sources of text type D against the rest of the Latin tradition. These are mainly lexical variants, 61. 14 morphological variants are attested, as well as 8 variations in word order. Portions of text unattested in the Vulgate are added 6 times, while 9 times parts of the Vulgate text are omitted. In 6 cases, lexical and morphological changes are combined. In 3 cases, modification to morphology and word order, once changes to vocabulary and word order, and once modifications to vocabulary, morphology, and word order. Then I singled out the variants that each manuscript shares with 135. 75 is the manuscript that has the highest number of variants, 81, shared with 135 against the rest of the Vetus Latina tradition. It is not surprising that the number of cases of agreement with 76, the copy of 75, is more or less comparable. 89 and 77 have 62 and 56 instances in common with 135 respectively, while 78, which is mostly Vulgate, has a lower number of similarities, only 27. In most of the instances, 135 agrees on a variant with more than one manuscript of this group. However, there are cases in which 135 shares a variant exclusively with one manuscript against the rest of the tradition of text type D. Such instances are not numerous. 89 has the highest number of readings in common, 10, against the rest of the tradition. Let's now turn to the qualitative analysis of the text. 135 often attests the same errors as the manuscript of text type D. For instance, at 1 Corinthians 2:11, tatu anthropo, human things, is rendered as que sit omnis or que sint hominum in 135 and 75. The concordance between a neuter plural subject and a singular verb is not grammatical in Latin. On the other hand, the Vulgate has the plural verb sint. 1 Corinthians 9:10 reads, Ediemas pantos legei, or does he not speak entirely for our sake? The adverb pantos, certainly, entirely, is rendered with the corresponding utique in the Vulgate. 135 and 89 have the demonstrative hec, which does not correspond to the Greek adverb. 1 Corinthians 10:7 reads, Me idololatre ginesta, do not become idolaters. Here the second person plural verb ginesta is translated by the second person plural verb efficiamini in the Vulgate. 75, 76, and 135 have the first plural form efficiamur, which may have been influenced by the first plural verbs in the next verse. It is striking that 135 shares these errors with manuscripts of text type D against the rest of the Latin tradition. In some cases, 135 attests variant readings, which are also present in Greek texts transmitted in bilingual manuscripts and are not attested in the Latin tradition outside bilingual manuscripts. It must be kept in mind that these Greek variants may have been influenced by the Latin texts present in the bilingual manuscripts. Nonetheless, since these variants are typical of the bilingual tradition, their attestation in 135 demonstrates a connection with bilingual manuscripts regardless of the origin of these variants in Latin or Greek. I selected two instances. 1 Corinthians 4:5, Oste me pro Kairu, ti crinete eos an eltheo Kyrios, os kai photisei ta cryptatus scotus, which means, therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness. The relative pronoun os is rendered with the corresponding qui in the Vulgate. The first hand of 06, 010, and 012 omit the relative pronoun os and make the sentence paratactic. In Latin, veniat Dominus et illuminabit abscondita tenebrarum. The omission of the relative pronoun is attested only in the Latin texts of bilingual manuscripts and 135. 1 Corinthians 9:18 reads, Ti umu estin omistos, what then is my wage? Nestlealan 28 has the present form estin, while the first hand of 06, 010, and 012, the future form estai. The bilingual manuscripts and 135 attest the corresponding future erit, while the Vulgate has the present. These instances shows that 135 also attests the translation of Greek variants typical of the bilingual tradition. At 1 Corinthians 12:21, 135 is particularly close to text type D. The verse reads, Udinatai de ophthalmose pein techeri, creian su uc echo, e palin e kephale tois posin, creian imon uc echo, which means the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. De is attested in the editorial text of Nestlealan 28 and is translated by Autem in 135, 75, and 76, and Ambrosiaster, while it is omitted in the rest of the Latin tradition. The word order, oculus icere, in 135, 75, 76, and Ambrosiaster, matches the Greek o ophthalmos eipein, while dicere oculus is attested in 89 and the Vulgate. Most importantly, 135 agrees with 89 on the translation of creian su echo. From the lexical point of view, 135, 75, 76, and 89 agree on the rendering non esse mi necessaria. However, only 89 and 135 have the direct speech with the verb in the second person singular form, while the third person singular est in 75 and 76 does not suit the meaning of the verse and is a possible scribal mistake. Ambrosiaster and the Vulgate have the different renderings opera tua non egeo or indigeo. Finally, 135 agrees on the rendering desidero operam vestram with 75, 76, and 89, but attests a different word order and a scribal mistake, opera vestra non desidero. Ambrosiaster and the Vulgate have the different translation non estis mi necessari. The analysis of this verse shows that 135 is close to the tradition of text type D in the translation of Greek variants and in the rendering of the vocabulary in morphology and word order. To conclude, the examination of 135 has shown that the manuscript contains a text close to the bilingual tradition of 1 Corinthians, and especially to 75. Therefore, 135 should be used as a source of text type D in 1 Corinthians. Nonetheless, as Fröhlich observed, several readings of text type I, and especially similarities with the Ambrosiaster's lemma text, are attested in 135. Overall, this manuscript contains a textual form similar to that of 89, where both D and I readings are mixed. In addition, the text of 1 Corinthians in 135 often attests readings unattested elsewhere. These conclusions have been reached by carrying out a quantitative analysis, which has demonstrated that 75 and 89 have the closest text to 135. Moreover, the qualitative analysis has shown that 135 shares with the sources of text type D errors, variants also attested in the Greek text transmitted by bilingual manuscripts, and many lexical variants. In conclusion, in light of this new evidence, Frede's argument that the Latin texts in bilingual manuscripts did not circulate outside the bilingual tradition cannot be maintained any longer. The evidence from 89 and 135 shows that readings of text type D are also massively attested in monolingual manuscripts copied in the 9th century. Furthermore, this discovery reinforces the idea that the Latin texts in bilingual manuscripts form a text type. These are not isolated translations, and their readings influence the rest of the Latin tradition. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It must always be satisfying to correct the big authorities in the field. We have plenty of time for discussion of this new discovery. Who wants to start? Yes, please.
Thank you, Anna. Very convincing as usual. Can I ask you something concerning the solo reading, those 180 something readings that 135 actually goes away on its own? What kind of features do those readings exhibit?
Yeah, actually, I have an instance here. It wasn't a slide anyway. There are some scribal mistakes, but not so many, so I excluded them. And the other readings that differ from the rest of the Latin tradition are mainly lexical divergences. However, it's quite difficult to explain some of those. And there is one example in which there is the word directio, while in Greek, we do not have anything that corresponds to that word, for example, and it's not very clear how that reading originated. So I would like to study more that aspect of the text, but yeah, it's in some cases actually there are similarities with text type D in those readings too, but there are maybe divergences in word order, for example. So these are not readings that are completely different from the rest of the Latin tradition, but in some way they diverge, either in the choice of the vocabulary or in word order and small morphological and syntactical changes.
No Greek correspondence?
No,
okay.
no,
That's important.
Yeah, because all these Latin texts probably go back to the same, as Oliver said, Greek Fröhlich. And so, no, they are not new translations of a different Greek text. No, that's not the case. Mostly variants internal to the Latin tradition.
Other questions? Comments?
Thank you for the super paper. I only had half an hour left before the library closed, which is why I didn't have more of a chance to look at Corinthians. And
Sure.
so it's really good to see the whole thing being examined. I'm really striking your conclusion that in the 9th century we have these copies of a Latin tradition in the bilinguals independently. The first question I had was, what does that? Do we have any idea about the archetype, the Vorlage of these manuscripts? The suggestion that Vetus Latina 89 is a copy of a commentary written around the year 400, but it would have been copied 400 years later. So, I mean, are we thinking these are potentially late antique manuscripts, which got to be about 300-400 years old, and were then copied again in the 9th century for some reason? And then the second question is, what else do we know about this Bible, if we know anything about that Vulgate Bible, about how it was put together? Is it a pandect from different sources, sort of one set for the Gospels and sort of one set for the Pauline Epistles and so on? Or is there any indication that it was already copied from a manuscript that had more than one of the New Testament collections?
The problem is that we need more study, because as far as I know, there are no studies on the biblical text in the other books contained in this manuscript. So there are some Old Testament writings, like I said, and for the New Testament, only the Pauline Epistles. So Oliver and I noticed this presence of elements of the D-text type in 1 Corinthians and Galatians, but of course we cannot reach definite conclusions before examining the other letters too. So I would be very careful in reaching general conclusions. And your first question regards the origin of this form of text in the 9th century. That's very difficult to explain. There may be a connection with Italy, since this manuscript was copied in Italy, and we also know that some bilingual manuscripts were copied in Italy, but of course Calambro Montanus is much earlier. So it's quite difficult to understand why in the 9th century we find Latin manuscripts that have again these elements of the bilingual tradition. So actually I do not have a definite answer for that. Yeah. If you have suggestions, please let me know.
May I come in on this, because it's just so fascinating to find this in, if you just look at one chapter, it looks like Vulgate. If you look at another one, it looks like text type D. And we know of manuscripts where, exemplars change throughout. And so you have a different kind of text in the first part and then in the later. So from the work you've done on 1 Corinthians in the earlier chapters, is the D text very different from the Vulgate, so that we could also say 135 is all in the first few chapters?
Yeah, because there are differences between D and the Vulgate in the first 5 chapters, which are the chapters that I edited so far in my Vetus Latina edition. And it's striking that in those chapters, 135 mostly disagrees with the manuscripts of the D tradition, and it agrees with manuscripts of the I tradition and Ambrosiaster and the Vulgate. So there is a clear shift in the affiliation of the biblical text.
And the most logical conclusion would then be to assume a different exemplar, or
maybe.
It's fascinating.
I only suggest to use these, like some of these, there's Chronicles edition, but it's quite recent. Maybe you observed some of these.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will have a look.
This is one of the documents.
Yes.
I can send you a PDF.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I would appreciate it.
Yeah, Pete.
It would be interesting just to see if it's the result of correction, to look at what patterns you have in Romans, what patterns you have in 2 Corinthians, to sort of see, does the pattern you have in the first few chapters of 1 Corinthians show up in Romans? Does the pattern you have at the end of 1 Corinthians show up in 2 Corinthians? In that case, it could be someone was revising the text and got tired of it, which happens all the time.
Yes, so as far as Romans are concerned, the manuscript has been included in the Vetus Latina collation. So Vetus Latina elements have been detected in Romans, but I do not know about the text type to which the texts belong in Romans, because we do not have a Vetus Latina critical edition for Romans. And I do not have actually information for 2 Corinthians. Actually, I transcribed 2 Corinthians too, but I still need to study the text. But to me, it looks like 2 Corinthians also has a text very close to text type D. So this tendency continues. It starts in 1 Corinthians 5 and it goes on in 2 Corinthians and Galatians. And then we do not know, because we need to progress with the study. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And please join me. And that brings us to the third speaker of this morning's session before we go to lunch. And in this case, there should be a handout in front of you. And if not, please be kind to your neighbor and share. Thank you. But somewhere in front of you, there should be the hand up. And with this, it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Montoro from Tildo.